The question that was put to me was why Christianity has a voice in ethical investment. Now, the why question is perhaps not that hard to answer. The reality is that Christianity and religion in general never exist in a vacuum. Christianity engages all of reality, and if it remains silent on certain topics, it generally means that it endorses the status quo. This is what Christianity unfortunately realized too late in my native Germany during the Nazi era. In any case, it is wise not to confuse religion and politics or economics, but religion has implications for politics and for economics, whether it realizes this or not. The same is true for the world of investment. If religion is silent about investment, it may end up endorsing the status quo. This is why the work that you're doing as ethical investors is so important. This work of ethical investment, in other words, is not an appendage to Christianity. In fact, if Christianity does not support and work with ethical investments, I would think it supports unethical investments by default. There is no way to keep out of this matter or to stay neutral. The question I want to spend the rest of my time on today is, what are the fundamentals of ethical investment in general, and what contributions can Christianity make to it? So the title I chose for this presentation is Effecting Positive Change Through Building Relationships and Solidarity. My title is inspired by words I found in your various statements in the material that was sent to me, including the notion of effecting positive change and the notion of solidarity. What connects these notions, I believe, is the matter of relationship, and this is where I would like to start. The three matters that we need to talk about this afternoon are all ultimately about relationships. Investments, this is my first point here, are ultimately matters of relationships. I'm sure you all realize this, but it bears emphasizing. Investments are matters about relationships, not just matters of money and finance. I'm surprised how many people seem to overlook it these days. Investments are matters of relationships. The same is true for ethics as well. Ethics is ultimately all about relationships. At the minimum, you could say that ethics is about the prevention of abusive relationships. Again, your documents state it clearly. You're not investing in businesses that cause harm to the community. This is ethical investment, preventing abusive relationships. Religion, my third point here, is also about relationships. Obviously, religion is often defined as relationships with the divine, but religion is also about relationships with other human beings. And this relationship with the divine and the relationships with other human beings are always related. One might say that abusive relationships in each of these realms are reflected in the other. And of course, we could say the same for positive relationships as well. So ethical investment in relation to religion then is a matter of minding relationships at all levels. But rather than start with more theory, let me illustrate my point with an ancient story that many of you probably know and remember perhaps from the old days in Sunday school. Here is the story of the unforgiving servant in the Gospel of Matthew. This is chapter 18, verses 23 through 34. Let me briefly read this text and then add some reflections to it. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And As he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." And out of pity for him, the lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, "Pay what you owe." And then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw that what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?" And in anger, his lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. Now, while you may have been familiar with the story, it really is an unusual story because it tells of an employer who forgives an employee an enormous amount of debt. And what happens after that is that the employee whose debt now has been forgiven has a choice. Think about it this way. The employee now has the choice whether he or she would forgive a debt that a coworker owes them. Before, that might have been impossible because there was too much debt owed to another entity. But now the person has the choice to forgive or not to forgive. And you know how the story continues, right? The person chooses not to forgive the debt. Now, this choice might perhaps be considered the normal response. The person who has been forgiven a debt now demands repayment, albeit of a much smaller debt. And then, of course, when the person cannot repay the debt, the coworker who is unable to pay is thrown in jail. That seems a normal response, and it looks like this requires an ethical rejoinder. But again, maybe this is the general logic of investment, right? Debts must be repaid. Any other option might be considered strange. This is how ethics is often perceived, a strange interference with the general logic that proceeds by making unusual demands. In this case, there is a conflict between the logic of investment on the one hand, which seems to demand repayment, and ethics and morality on the other, which seem to demand forgiveness. And in this scenario, the only way to get from one to the other is to make strong ethical demands. You should do this, you must do that. Do this, don't do that. Unfortunately, as we all know, these kinds of stories often end in disappointment. This is exactly what happens in the story here in Matthew 18. There is, however, another possible response to the scenario that fascinates me. Think about it this way. What if the alternative to the general logic was not a moral imperative, you must do this, you must do that, but a solution that actually made more sense than what actually happens in the story? So at the core of my alternative scenario is not morality, a moral demand, you must do this, you must do that, but another kind of relationship. Now, think about it once again. Having been forgiven an enormous debt, the employee now has the choice to forgive a smaller debt of a fellow employee. Of course, the employee doesn't go that route. The employee insists on repayment of the debt, but there's a choice between forgiving and repaying. Why might the forgiving scenario actually make more sense than the repaying scenario? That to me is the interesting question. Is it just a moral demand, or is this a situation that might actually be logical, a different logic to be sure? Why, in other words, would forgiving make more sense than collecting the debt? In the case of this employee, think about it this way. The choice was between having a few extra coins in his pocket or a relationship with somebody else that might be lasting for a long time, that might actually mushroom into other relationships as well, right? Because people whose debt have been forgiven, debts have been forgiven, can now forgive other people as well, and so on and so on. So rather than having a few extra coins, forgiving establishes a relationship, and having this relationship logically is worth perhaps a lot more than having a few extra coins. So what's more valuable, the few coins in your pocket or the solidarity of the community? This is what I would like to call the logic of solidarity. And I'm insisting that this is not just ethical demand, it is really an alternative logic that makes a lot of sense. There's another logic, in other words, that's possible here, that's not primarily built on some tried ethical rules. And maybe this logic of solidarity ultimately is what could drive and inform a logic of ethical investment. Come to think of it, it seems like a pretty logical move. There's some important lessons for economics here as well. In my interpretation, this parable does not moralize. You ought to forgive. You should do this. You should do that. It just never happens, or rarely it happens, right? In my interpretation, the parable reminds us that there are two different logics at work, and maybe one makes more sense than the other. There's a choice to be made here. And the two logics here are between the logic of a little more money in your pocket, a couple of more coins, and the logic of solidarity. In my mind, that's the actual difference between investment and ethical investment, arguing that ethical investment is not just morally superior choice, but it actually makes more sense. Unfortunately, even many people of faith and many preachers don't get it. At best, they keep moralizing without understanding the alternative logic of relationship that's presented here. My observations in this presentation are informed by what is oftentimes now called intersectionality. This is to say, it's informed by a concern for abusive relationships and relations of race, gender, and the economy. The first response from people of faith about these abusive relationships is oftentimes charity. We want to help those who are disadvantaged in any of these areas, whether it be race, gender, or the economy. But what I'm arguing for is that a more profound response would not be charity, but rebuilding relationships and recognizing our solidarity. As in the old parable, the employee could have realized the relationship, could have built the relationship rather than collecting a few coins, and perhaps what at the time seemed like a small advantage. So the profound response here, if it is rebuilding relationships and recognizing our solidarity, is an alternative that I would like to discuss a little bit more in this presentation. I find it, by the way, also in your documents that were mailed to me that talk about commitments to solidarity with the poor, the marginalized, and the planet, therefore really using the term solidarity and thereby talking about relationships. Keep in mind that at the heart of solidarity is not, first of all, some moral appeal, but an understanding that we're all connected. That we're all connected whether we realize this or not. In other words, at the heart of this solidarity, of this relationship, is the realization that is what is happening to the so-called least of these is happening to all of us. This, by the way, is not only a profound human insight, you can find it in the New Testament as well. The Apostle Paul knew this, for instance, in his description of the church as the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians 12. There he says, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. And if one member is honored, all are rejoicing together with it. This is not just a pious idea or an ethical imperative, you must suffer with those who suffer. It's actually an observation of reality. You can see the reality of this, that if one of us suffer, all of us suffer in various places around us in everyday life. Perhaps these days we can see it most clearly when looking at the environment. If the air is polluted, some of us suffer, but ultimately all of us are connected. All of us suffer. One member suffers, all suffer together with it, says Paul. The same is true for climate change. If the climate is changing, all of us are affected eventually, even though some of us, of course, can protect ourselves better than others. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it, says Paul. So here, solidarity and relationship are not just moral imperatives, they are what life is all about. This is the basic building blocks of life. Let's take another look at this logic of solidarity. It used to be taken for granted that the concern of business was the interest of stockholders alone. This, by the way, is still a widespread assumption and taught in many of our business schools. In recent years, as you probably all know, there has been a broader debate that included not only stockholders, but also shareholders and ultimately stakeholders. I think this is a good direction of the conversation, but we may have to push it a little bit further. This is again taking us back to the fundamental principles of ethical investment, and I would argue to the fundamental principles of Christianity and many other religions as well. It is the notion of stakeholders I want to focus a little bit more on, because it takes us back to the matter of relationship and solidarity. Ultimately, everything depends on how we define it. Often, we define the notion of shareholders and stakeholders too narrowly. I've seen it in the literature. Forbes magazine is an example that stakeholders are now interpreted mainly as consumers. But there's more. And again, this is something that I was very happy to see in your documents. Stakeholders in business, stakeholders in investment, therefore also are not just stockholders, not just shareholders, not just customers, but also working people. This is one that's oftentimes overlooked, especially in the United States, where we have a hard time talking about workers' rights and working people. But this is part of your document, and I commend you for it, and I would encourage all of us to think more about the meaning of this. Stakeholders, of course, also include communities, including indigenous communities, the environment, and all that surrounds us. Think about this relationship. Think about solidarity here as deeply as possible. The Christian tradition here can help us further expand our understanding of stakeholders. In the Hebrew Bible, you might recall there is a lot of conversation about the widows, the orphans, and the strangers. These are not just objects of charity, but they are stakeholders. Stakeholders in our investments, in our business decisions. And something changes when you consider this group, widows, orphans, and strangers, not merely as objects of charity, but as stakeholders. There's more to it, though, because once you look at God in relation to the widows, the orphans, and strangers, you also see God in relation to everybody else, creation, the universe, the cosmos. And for Christians, you see God in relation to Jesus, who, as we all know, was born into a working family of day laboring workers in construction. In fact, if you follow images of God in the Bible, you might be surprised how many images of the divine in both testaments describe God oftentimes as a working person. Again, add that to your stakeholders, God as a working person, oftentimes doing menial labor, work traditionally assigned to women. If you go back to the beginning of the Bible, you'll find in the creation stories, God planting a garden, God forming Adam from clay. Not God commanding somebody else to plant, but God planting, not God commanding somebody else to form Adam from clay, but God getting the divine hands dirty. That's a reflection on solidarity and relationship, and it broadens our understanding of stakeholdership in meaningful ways. Now, as investors, you may not be interested in the theological and philosophical debates that take off from these observations, although you might, and I'd be very happy to follow up with any of you who would like to say and think more about this. This is my work. But there's one question I want to pose here at the end that is relevant to all of us. And here it is. What if the most important thing in the world was indeed relationships? What if the most important thing in the world was indeed relationships? And what if these relationships were to include everyone, including those whom Jesus called the least of these? I'm arguing that this might change the way we live our lives in all areas and in all aspects. This is the work that we do as theologians, but I think it's very similar to the work that's done by ethical investment. And I think we're together in this work. We share our concerns, and I appreciate your time. I appreciate your concern, and I wish you all the best for your important work, knowing that we're together in this, knowing that this is a work that keeps continuing. In some ways, it's only beginning. Thank you for all that you do, and please feel free to be in touch. I'd be happy to be in ongoing conversations about these issues. Thank you.